Good morning, everyone. My name is Ellie Garrity, and I'm the manager of Alumni Career Programs with the Alumni Association. We are excited that you're able to join us this morning for today's Terp Talk, Business as Unusual, presented by Greg Currey. This webinar is part of the Alumni Association's professional development webinar series, in which we hope to provide thought-provoking and valuable content that will help alumni like you achieve your personal and professional goals. Please keep a close eye on our upcoming webinar series as we look to provide relevant content during the COVID-19 outbreak to help you continue to be successful at work and at home. This webinar today will be recorded and sent to your email for your records. By participating, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, and voice being recorded. Okay, we have a lot of information to cover today, and we want you to get the most out of this webinar. Our presenter has about an hour for interactive content, and there will be tons of time for questions, so feel free to drop your questions into the chat box. Now, about our presenter, Greg Currey is an experienced attorney who focuses his practice on labor and employment law, corporate law, commercial litigation, and corporate immigration matters. He represents companies and individuals at all stages of an issue, regardless of whether a client is seeking general advice, an independent sounding board is seeking to avoid litigation, or is already involved in litigation. Greg also works to keep his clients aware of current developments by frequently speaking and writing on the latest developments in employment and immigration law. Now, without further ado, I'd love to welcome Greg to begin his presentation. Go ahead, Greg.
Good morning. Thank you all for taking the time to join me here today. As Ellie mentioned, one of the main things I'm doing right now is helping and counseling employers and business owners who have questions about sort of what should they be doing and what's going on now with COVID-19. As one of my colleagues likes to say, a lot of the things that are going on, it's like drinking from a fire hose, because every day things are changing. We're getting new directives from the governor's office, regardless of whatever state you're in. First, generally speaking, the pattern was first schools started closing, then essential businesses or non-essential businesses started closing, then restrictions were put in place on how essential businesses were supposed to operate. All but 7 states now have some form of a shelter-in-place order. And so as these things have all rolled out, businesses and companies have had to adapt. Then in the background of that, you've got state level and federal legislation that's come out, providing paid sick leave for employees, providing additional family and medical leave for employees, creating the Paycheck Protection Program, which provides for small business loans for employers. We'll talk about that more later, but as that's gone on, initially it was $350 billion. The White House is now seeking an additional $250 billion because so much of that money has already been sucked out, distributed to businesses, and there's still a massive amount of demand for those loans. And then you've now got the Federal Reserve talking about expanding their Main Street lending program, which is going to create another low interest loan availability for businesses that have been impacted by COVID-19. This is an ongoing situation. It looks like in the states that have been very aggressive in adopting measures to limit the spread, like New York, New Orleans, Washington State, they've been pretty effective at limiting the spread, and we're starting to see some encouraging results. But, we're more likely than not, we're going to be looking at things for at least another 6 weeks. The idea about reopening the country on May 1 at this point seems pretty unrealistic. So we want to sort of go through what businesses are doing right now to deal with COVID-19, what the different leave laws are, what the different stimulus programs have been enacted, and sort of give some guidance in terms of what business owners can be doing to keep things running as smoothly as possible. So like I said, briefly, we're going to talk about how to maintain business as usual or the closest thing possible in light of current circumstances. Next thing, we're going to talk about how COVID-19 and the Americans with Disabilities Act interact, because I get a lot of questions about those issues related to questions with employees that are showing up to work, that are claiming illnesses, whether they have underlying medical conditions that make them at greater risk of contracting COVID-19 or experiencing some of the more deadly complications. We'll talk about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, because I've gotten a lot of questions about that. The Department of Labor issued regulations on April 2nd that provide a lot more clarification in terms of the documentation you have to get from employees, what absences are truly going to be covered by that. The Department of Labor has come under some fire because they changed one of the requirements. It was supposed to be for the leave to care for minor children. It was supposed to be any child under the age of 18. They've come back now and said that if the child is over the age of 14 during daylight hours, you're going to need a special statement as to the special circumstances that require the parent to be unable to work to care for that child, essentially creating this presumption that 14, 15, 16-year-old children are able to be some level of self-sufficient such that parents don't necessarily need to take leave to care for those children. I think that's a false assumption. Obviously, one of the main concerns you want right now is, first of all, with remote learning and social distancing, you want to ensure that those 14 and 15-year-old kids are doing their curriculum and also not going out and hanging out with their friends. If you're not home, you've got a 16-year-old home with a car, you're not able to enforce pretty much anything at that point. Unfortunately, for a lot of employers, COVID-19 has meant layoffs, furloughs, and reductions in force. I'm going to talk about some of the considerations around those and things you should be doing to ensure that a layoff today to save the business doesn't doom you in 6 months' time with a flood of lawsuits. And then I'll talk a little bit about the latest developments, stimulus, and other assistance for business owners that I touched on briefly already. I believe we have a poll that we can launch now while I talk about my background.
Great, just launched it, Greg, for you.
Okay. So the first question, while I briefly tell you all about myself, how has your business been affected by the coronavirus? A, we're in a non-essential industry and been totally shut down. B, we're in an essential industry and are operating normally. C, we're an essential industry, but most employees are working remotely. D, we're in an essential industry, but have had to limit services. Or D, E, none of the above. So as Ellie mentioned, I have been an employment lawyer for pretty much my entire career. Funny story, coming out of law school, I thought I wanted to get into general litigation and started working for a firm primarily doing construction work. But then in 2008, due to the recession, there was almost no construction work going on, but everybody had employment questions. And I got transferred to a different department within my firm. And I have been an employment attorney ever since that time. One of my favorite things that I get to do isn't so much the litigation, but what I really enjoy doing is working with business owners, helping them figure out plans and put in place best practices to keep their employees engaged, happy, and doing what they do. A lot of times when you tell people you represent employers, they say, "Oh, you work for the dark side." I say, not really, because using my platform, I'm able to hopefully make lives better for employees while also maintaining operations for the business that are as profitable as possible. And so briefly going to current status. In Maryland and most states, non-essential businesses have been closed and the services that they've been able to provide are limited. Schools and daycares have been closed indefinitely. In Maryland, it's the end of April and they're going to reevaluate. Virginia, I know, has already closed through the end of the school year. I believe DC is doing that as well. More and more, I think we can expect that unless you are in a truly unusual state that's going to bring the kids back for a very short period of time, this school year is effectively going to be over. Various legislation has now been passed, creating paid leave for employees affected by COVID-19 who have childcare needs related to COVID-19. State unemployment benefits have been modified in most states. The CARES Act has been passed, but by and large, it has not been implemented in most states. And so the $600 per week kicker that's going to boost unemployment benefits is still in process in most, if not all, states. If you've been following the news around unemployment issues, you've seen, first of all, crazy spikes in unemployment that we've almost never seen before. Most states over the past 3 weeks, they've been getting, the equivalent of an annual load of unemployment filings in just a 3-week period. That's left most of these unemployment offices scrambling, not only trying to process the claims that have been filed, but also implement the new changes. In most states, for the most part, unemployment benefits are not very generous. In Maryland, it's capped at $430 per week. In Virginia, I believe it's about $380 per week. In other states, it may be higher or lower. And so that's why the CARES Act is so important, because for most employees, if they've lost their jobs due to COVID-19, unemployment is not going to give them the kind of relief that they need to keep their homes, keep their families fed, things like that. And so what it does is it adds $600 per week across the board, regardless of the amount that you're earning from unemployment, to at least get to a threshold level where it's something a little bit more manageable for most Americans. Similarly, legislation passed for significant stimulus. What's been getting a lot of attention is the payroll protection program, but there are other tax benefits for employers that have been able to keep employees on payroll without taking out a loan. There have been benefits for government contractors. So I don't know, based on who's registered, if there are any government contractors here. There's what's called Section 3610 of the CARES Act, which allows contracting officers to pay their contractors to keep employees in a ready state, essentially keeping them paid while not working if they're unable to work due to closure of the government offices where they would be working. I think Ellie's going to be monitoring the chat as we go along, so if people do have questions, we'll hopefully be able to get to them. I've included frequently asked questions in the sections as we go through, so that if people have, just to sort of go over some of the common questions that I've been seeing. But if you have other questions, please submit them. If we don't get to them during the webinar, we will try to get you an answer via email afterwards.
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to monitor the chat box for you, Greg. And we do have the poll results. If you're interested, I'm happy to share those with you, just so you know who's on the webinar with us today.
Yeah, that'd be great.
We have about 56% of folks say that they're an essential industry, but have had to limit their services. And then we do have some folks that say that they're an essential industry, but most employees are working remotely. And then there's a couple non-essential industries that have been totally shut down. And then to your second question, looks like 44% of folks have had small layoffs and or reductions in hours. Some have kept staffing levels the same, but it looks like we have a little bit of everything for your second question. So some people have had to lay off or furlough a majority of their workforce and have had significant layoffs too. So it looks like you got a little bit of everyone. And if it's helpful, people can chat in the chat box what their role is or where they're working, just to give you a better idea of where people are coming from. But those are the results for you.
All right, great. Thank you. So this is pretty common. The way that the essential, non-essential businesses have been broken down, it's pretty broad what's considered an essential business. Because when you really get into the weeds and you say, okay, well, we have to have hospitals open, we have to have grocery stores open, we have to have manufacturing open, then you get into the supply chain. So you have to have the gas stations open so that people can fill their cars to get to the grocery store or get to work if they're working an essential job. You have to have the car repair shops in case an essential worker's car breaks down. If everybody's stuck at home repair companies are going to be essential, because you can't just have a pipe burst in your house and not have it remediated. Legal services are considered essential. Until recently, we were actually allowed to go into the office on a reduced schedule based on social distancing guidelines, but we've been basically told to all work remotely lately too. And so a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the clients I'm advising are a combination of A, C, and D. Almost no one, even if you're in an essential industry, is operating normally. And that's sort of why we're seeing a lot of 0% on that question. While in the early days, some of the essential industries may have been trying to operate as though things were just business as usual. As things have changed, that's just not a possibility. Here in Maryland, in fact, if businesses are not complying with the CDC's guidelines in terms of safe distancing, hand washing, making cleaning products available, the local health departments have been authorized to actually close those businesses. And so you're starting to see things like the grocery stores reducing capacities to 25% of what they're normally permitted, putting arrows on the floor so that people are told which way to walk as they go through the grocery store, boxes near the checkout lines where everybody has to stand 6 feet apart. So more and more, even the essential industries, the people that have to stay open, are experiencing significant upheaval. For employers that are able to have their staff work remotely, it's been great because for the most part, they've been able to do the things that you would want to do to keep things running normally, right? You're reducing exposure with virtual or telephonic meeting, environmental changes, and more. If people do have to go into the office, employers are definitely focusing on making cleaning supplies available, particularly early when they were able to get them, and educating their employees about how to maintain safe workspaces by targeting high-touch items like doorknobs, handles, bathrooms, coffee makers, and trying to create that ritualistic culture among employees and having an increased cleaning schedule. I work with a couple of cleaning companies, and they're telling me right now, for them, business is booming because everybody wants increased cleaning, higher level of sanitation, things like that for the employees that are required to still go into work. Early on, I was getting a lot of questions because all of the news stories, when you talk about, oh, here's COVID-19's coming, you're going to have everybody work remotely. Well, there's a lot of people that can't work remotely, and there's a lot of things that you can't do remotely. And so you have to be careful when you're crafting your plan of how you're going to maintain operations. You've got to figure out, well, can this be done remotely or not? For example, for many people, telework is just not going to be possible. They've got kids at home. They may not have quality internet access, or they may have essential functions that require an in-person presence. And you see this a lot. Checking the mail, making sure the building is secured. If you've got any kind of food service or delivery company, they can't telework. And so the advice from the government saying, oh, just have everybody telework. Functionally, that's not always going to be practical. And so what you need to do is figure out if you're allowed to still operate and you're still allowed to stay open, what's going to require an in-person presence, and then how do we modify the schedule so that employees are able to work safely? Maintaining social distancing guidelines are key. Having proper cleaning supplies is important, and not just staffing everyone. And then once you say, okay, well, we can't just staff everyone, then you're under the question of, are we going to furlough half of our staff and let the other half come in? Are we going to reduce schedules? How are we going to do that? How do we navigate complications related to partial unemployment so that we can maximize what benefits employees are receiving? And then you also want to make sure that employees that are sick are not coming to work and getting other employees sick. During times like these, it's also important to remind your employees of their benefits. For health benefits, if your plan offers telemedicine, that's going to be huge. So many providers now are moving to a telemedicine-based platform for things like visits, minor illnesses, checkups, things like that. Providers have been authorized to do a lot of things virtually. And so if you have a telemedicine benefit through your health insurance plan, make sure your employees know it and make sure they know how to use it. There's a lot that providers are able to diagnose now through telemedicine. And if you have that benefit, that way employees that are nervous or fearful about contracting COVID-19 in an emergency room, they can still get the help they need online. You're also going to want to recommunicate, if you haven't already, what your leave benefits are in terms of sick leave, PTO, short-term disability policies, FMLA, and flexible leave. These are all important because, as we'll discuss later, the extended family and medical leave and the paid sick leave under the FFCRA do not cover as paid extended absences due to complications from coronavirus. And so if an employee gets coronavirus and generally speaking, the practical guidelines are that they're going to be quarantined for a 2-week period. They're going to be unable to work for 2 weeks. But if you contract pneumonia as a result, for example, and you need to be hospitalized, that's not paid after those 2 weeks. And so employees are going to be looking to their existing paid leave policies. They're going to be looking to their short-term disability policies, and they're going to be looking to the FMLA policy once those are exhausted for unpaid job protections, because the expanded family and medical leave under the FFCRA only provides paid leave when it's for child care related purposes. It doesn't provide paid leave for other absences necessitated by an employee's illness. The last thing I want to touch on in terms of the benefit reminders, to the extent you haven't already looked into these things, are mental health benefits. A lot of people are nervous, anxious, they're cooped up at home, they're working in unusual environments, and we're dealing with unusual times and circumstances. And so you want to make sure that you're checking in on your employees and making sure that if they are feeling stress or anxiety or depression due to COVID-19 or the current situations, you want to make sure that they're aware of what mental health benefits are available and what they can access through that, so that they're getting the help that they need and not going through all of this alone. A lot of the employers that I talk to, the main watchword for these people is flexibility right now, right? The idea is that if you're going to operate as business as usual, you're going to have people teleworking, be firm about what needs to get done, but be flexible about how it gets done. Because everybody working at home is dealing with different circumstances, they're dealing with different issues. More often than not these days, you've got 2 working parents. So if it's a family with children, they're juggling schedules, they're trying to balance, okay, who's going to do the virtual lesson plan for the kids in school while the other one handles the conference call. And so, don't expect necessarily that employees are going to be able to sit at their desk from 9 to 5 and work as though it's business as usual, just remotely. Everybody is dealing with unusual circumstances, and so keep that in mind and give people the space that they need. The other thing is check in on your employees. I've been hearing a lot of success stories about regular Zoom calls, things like setting up workout programs where people can all work out together, any kind of virtual presence where you're able to check in and allow people to connect and have a little bit of the social aspect that they get from their jobs that keep them from feeling isolated at home all day. That's going to be a positive thing. Over the years, companies that initially led the rush to move to telework, a lot of them pulled away from telework for a lot of the reasons we're going to be seeing over the coming weeks now, is that the social aspect of work is really underrated. Being stuck at home and staying at home takes a toll after a while. For the first 2 weeks, everybody's like, oh, great, I don't have a commute. I don't have to deal with rush hour. I've got some flexibility. I can get my laundry done. I can cook and eat healthier. My kids see me at lunchtime. But as it goes on and on and on, that isolation from coworkers is going to make it harder. It also makes it harder to check in and communicate about projects and plans. And so if employees are having difficulties collaborating, you need to be flexible in terms of finding solutions that allow them to collaborate and get their jobs done. I've also gotten a lot of questions about employer liability. First and foremost, everybody's worried, am I liable to an employee if they contract COVID-19 at work, whether that's through workers' compensation or a general tort claim arising out of negligence or otherwise? Luckily for employers and for most people, generally speaking, claims related to contracting a communicable disease at work are not viable. Workers' compensation doesn't consider it an occupational disease because it's not unique to any particular workplace. For a negligence-based claim, an employer is really only going to be liable if they're not following whatever the applicable standard of care is. And so if you are an essential employer, you're open for business, you're following the CDC social distancing guidelines, you're following the cleaning protocols that have been laid out, you're not going to be subject to liability for an employee lawsuit if they contract COVID-19 because they've still been showing up to work. Similarly, if an employee goes to work, contracts COVID-19 and pass it on to their spouse or family member, again, generally speaking, the case law is that absent some serious dereliction in duty, employers are not liable to employees' spouses or family members if they contract communicable diseases at work. For employers looking for what they should be doing to protect their employees, again, look to the CDC guidelines, look to the World Health Organization. They have the information and best practices for employers available about how to protect the employees. Generally speaking, it's the social distancing, 6 feet away at all times, limit the number of people that are in the office at any given time, and have cleaning products available with it, with at least some percentage. I think it's the 1 part to 5 parts water bleach solution to clean up after employees between shifts and so on. The last piece is if you're an essential employer, a lot of now what we're seeing is asymptomatic employees refusing to come to work because they're afraid of contracting COVID-19. None of the paid sick laws protect these individuals absent some sort of medical advice that they not go into work. And so if somebody is simply afraid to go into work because they don't want to catch COVID-19, your existing policies are going to provide for whatever paid or unpaid leave those people are entitled to. Generally speaking, we're encouraging employers to be flexible, but that's only possible to a limited extent. I mean, everyone, if you are operating and you're an essential business, you've got to conduct certain operations. And so you can place these people on an unpaid period of leave, but you're not going to be able to use the benefits from the FFCRA. You're not going to be able to use the benefits from other laws. And so essentially those people are going to be limited to whatever paid leave or leaves of absences you're willing to provide for them. How COVID-19 interacts with the Americans with Disabilities Act is an important issue. The EEOC has issued a couple of rounds of guidance now as to what steps an employer can take to protect its workforce from COVID-19. The fact that it's been declared a pandemic gives employers more leeway in what they're allowed to do and what questions they're allowed to ask of their employees. Employers are permitted with COVID-19 to ask employees questions about whether or not they've experienced symptoms of COVID-19, prevent them from showing up to work if they have symptoms or they've reported experienced symptoms. While it's not always a good idea because individuals may not have temperatures may not have temperatures while still having COVID-19, employers you can take your employee's temperature when they show up to work, like one of those forehead temporal scanners, to ensure that employees are not showing up to work with a fever. However, you are still required to follow the confidentiality requirements of the ADA. And so if an employee comes to work and they are later diagnosed with COVID-19, you'll want to share with your employees that have come into contact with that person that they've been exposed to somebody with COVID-19. You are not to identify that person. You're not allowed to ask other questions about other medical conditions that may make someone more susceptible. Those are all still required to be kept confidential, but you can, once an employee has been diagnosed with COVID-19, you will want to provide coworkers with that information that they've been exposed to someone, that they need to check their symptoms, that they may want to contact the medical provider to determine whether or not they can be tested. Because generally speaking, there's anywhere from a 1 to 2 week incubation period where someone may have been exposed to someone who is asymptomatic but had COVID-19. They may be also asymptomatic but actually have contracted COVID-19. A lot of employers were asking about doctor's notes. Generally speaking, right now, it's very difficult to get doctor's notes confirming that someone does not have COVID-19. Testing is still pretty limited. It's getting to be more and more widely available. But if someone is asymptomatic, generally speaking, you're going to have to verify that they allow them to self-verify that they don't have COVID-19, because it's going to be really hard to get a doctor's note saying that they do not have COVID-19. Obviously, if they can get tested, you do want them to, but you want to be flexible in terms of what kind of proof you require that employees are fit and able to work. Again, you can require that employees have their temperature taken before coming into work, but please note that that's not always going to be a reliable indicator that they do or do not have COVID-19. So that gets us to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. The idea behind the Families First Coronavirus Response Act is to stop the spread of germs by providing additional paid leave to employees who may not have it otherwise or may have already used their paid sick leave provided by employers, so that they'll actually stay home, self-isolate, and prevent the spread of the disease. It was enacted on March 18th, 2020, and was effective April 1st. Two major components are additional paid sick leave and paid FMLA leave for child care leave. Going into the paid sick leave, I'm going to move through this section a little bit more quickly until I get to some of the FAQs, just because a lot of people now know sort of the general basics about the paid sick leave requirements. There are 6 qualifying reasons for paid sick leave under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. The first 3 are paid at the employee's regular rate up to $511 per day. First, if the employee is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order due to COVID-19. 2, a healthcare provider advised the employee to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. Again, self-imposed quarantine without medical advice does not qualify under the Act for the paid sick leave. Third, the employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and seeking a medical diagnosis. As the Department of Labor has issued regulations, that second piece is critical. An employee is not going to be entitled to the paid sick leave under the FFCRA if they are not actively seeking a medical diagnosis. I'll get through the next 3 reasons for the paid sick leave, and then I'll go into some of the different questions people have about the paid leave. The paid sick leave is paid at 2/3 of the employee's rate, or up to $200 per hour, or per day, for the final 3 reasons for paid sick leave under the FFCRA. If the employee is caring for an individual who is either subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order, or is caring for someone who has been advised to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. 2, if the employee is caring for the employee's child whose school has been closed or place of care is unavailable due to COVID-19 precautions, or if the employee is experiencing any other substantially similar condition specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with the Secretaries of Treasury and Labor. All right. Here are 6, in this slide, I've got 6 of the most frequently asked questions. There's a lot of other ones that I'm going to go over because this is the biggest area where I've been getting questions from employers, and then the expanded family medical leave that I'm going to go over next. First, what verification can I require? The Department of Labor has set out in their guidelines specific information that employees or employers are required to collect from their employees when they take leave covered on the FFCRA in order to get the tax credits for this paid leave. Again, the paid sick leave under the FFCRA applies to all employers with fewer than 500 employees. If you're a large employer with more than 500 employees, you are not covered by this law. If you have fewer than 500 employees, you're covered by this law. You're required to provide the paid sick leave, but then you get a tax rebate for the amount of leave that you provide to the employees. So to get that tax rebate, you need to maintain records in your files. You don't send these records into the IRS. You keep them in case you're audited. You need to keep the employee's name, the date or dates for which leave was requested, a statement of the COVID-19 related reason the employee is requesting leave and written support for such reason, and then a statement that the employee is unable to work, including by means of telework, for such reason. Generally speaking, so if they are taking leave for the third reason, for example, where they are experiencing symptoms and they are seeking medical confirmation whether or not they have COVID-19, that's going to be, they're going to, the verification you're going to require is that they contact their medical provider, the name of the medical provider, when they contacted them, and what they were told to do. If they were experiencing minor symptoms and were told, look, you're not going to get a test, you need to self-isolate, they're going to qualify under the second provision of the Act. If they are told, yes, you can get a test, but you can't get it for a week, you need to self-isolate until you can get the test for that week, that's going to be sufficient to qualify under the third reason. For the first reason, I'm getting a lot of questions. Well, if I've been ordered to close because I'm a non-essential business, don't all my employees qualify for paid sick leave under the FFCRA because they're unable to work due to a federal, state, or local order? The answer to that question is, generally speaking, going to be no. The Department of Labor has said that employees are not eligible for paid sick leave under the FFCRA if there's no work for them to do. And so if the business as a whole is ordered to be closed, they're not going to get paid sick leave under the FFCRA, and the employer's not going to get that tax rebate. What that provision covers are situations where an employee, for example, has traveled to an area that now a returning employee is subject to quarantine. For example, initially when Governor Hogan issued the executive order closing non-essential businesses, he also put in place an order that anyone who had recently traveled to New York was subject to a mandatory 14-day quarantine. That, if you had an employee that had traveled to New York and was subject to that mandatory 14-day quarantine, that would qualify for the paid sick leave under the FFCRA for the first reason. A lot of employers are asking for return to work notes. Again, you can ask for a return to work note, but generally speaking, please be aware that it's going to be difficult to get that confirmation other than verification from the employee that they have not experienced any symptoms for at least 24 hours. If an employee has had a fever, generally speaking, the guidance is either to wait the full quarantine period of 14 days after they've gotten sick, even if they stop having symptoms on day 5, or at least get verification that they have been asymptomatic for at least 24 hours after they've experienced symptoms. The FFCRA provides for up to 80 hours of paid sick leave over a 10-day period or 10 business day period. Part-time employees are entitled to a pro rata amount of leave that would be equivalent to 2 weeks based on their ordinary schedule. So if you have part-time employees that regularly work 20 hours per week, they're entitled to 20 hours of FFCRA leave per week, just as essentially to make up for the amount of time that they would have worked. Because of the lag time between the effective date on March 18th, or the enactment date on March 18th, 2020, and the effective date on April 1, a lot of employers were forced to shut down or curtail operations based on government orders. And so a lot of employees were laid off before April 1. And so I get a lot of questions, well, if an employee is laid off or furloughed, are they entitled to take the paid leave under the FFCRA? Again, the answer to that is no. If an employee is laid off, they are no longer entitled to the paid sick leave under the FFCRA. And so they're going to want to look to the enhanced unemployment benefits under the CARES Act, which again, the states are still working to implement. We're told that they're going to be paid retroactively once they do get everything up and running, but they're not going to see that immediately either. But if an employee is laid off before April 1, they're not going to be entitled to the paid sick leave or the expanded FMLA leave under the FFCRA. Instead, they're just going to get unemployment. If an employee is on sick leave, so suppose you hadn't laid off employees on April 1, but you decide, you know what, we've been looking at operations, the cash flow just isn't enough. On April 20, we're going to have to do some layoffs. If an employee is already on the expanded FMLA, their entitlement to the paid leave under the expanded FMLA or their entitlement to paid sick leave will end on April 20th. So if you had an employee start paid sick leave April 13th, they've been paid all week, but then April 20th hits and they're all going to be, and that employee would otherwise be laid off, their entitlement to paid sick leave stops, even though they haven't used up the full allotment of paid sick leave under the FFCRA. And again, that employee is going to be forced to look at unemployment for their benefits. So it's important for employers to keep that issue in mind when they're structuring furloughs or layoffs, depending on whether or not they want the employees to be able to take that paid sick leave. The last question is, can an employee who is teleworking also receive paid caregiver leave? The answer is yes, if they're unable to telework. If an employee can still telework, but simply has to work different hours of the day or at different times because they're caring for example, if they're caring for a child whose school is closed. If they're unable to telework because they have to take care of that child, they are eligible for the paid sick leave. If their telework simply requires that they restructure their day or work at other hours, then that individual will not get the paid caregiver leave. They have to be unable to perform work. That also gets us into a question. Remember, if you have employees that are paid on a salary basis, or otherwise they're exempt employees, they need to be paid their full salary for any work week in which they perform any productive work. Full day absences necessitated by the employee's need may be unpaid or subject to your standard PTO policies. But if they perform any productive work in a work day, they need to be paid for that full day. So if you have employees that are salaried employees and they're working, they get their full salary. If they're teleworking and they say, look, I can telework for 4 hours a day, you can't just cut their pay in half. You have to pay them for the full day. But what you may want to look into is using partial benefits under the FFCRA to at least recoup some of the costs related to the employee's reduced productivity. The next piece that I want to talk about is the extended family and medical leave under the FFCRA. This is going to be something that employers are going to be dealing with for a long time. Schools are probably going to be closed through the end of the semester, and then childcare is going to be disrupted over the summer. The extended family and medical leave under the FFCRA creates paid FMLA leave if the employee is unable to work or telework due to a need for leave to care for a minor child due to a public health emergency, such as COVID-19. Again, it applies to all employers with fewer than 500 employees. The first 2 weeks are unpaid. The last 10 weeks are paid at 2/3 of an employee's regular rate, up to $200 per day. Unlike the FMLA, employees are eligible after only 30 days of employment. You don't have the traditional 1-year waiting period. Employers with fewer than 50 employees may be eligible for an exemption. When the law was initially passed, if you look at the actual text in the statute, if employers with fewer than 50 employees wanted to exempt themselves, they needed to submit an application to the Department of Labor. That has changed. Now what the Department of Labor is saying is that you simply you provide the employee written notification as to the reasons why you're exempting them from the extended family and medical leave under the Act, and you maintain those records for yourself. This creates a lot of risk for employers because if you self-designate as exempt and the employee decides to challenge it through a lawsuit, you're not going to have the safety of saying, well, look, the Department of Labor told me that I'm exempt. I was allowed to do this. You're essentially going to need to be careful and make sure that you're using, closely adhering to the standards that the Department of Labor has issued on that. For the extended family and medical leave, one of the main questions I've been getting is, can the leave be used on an intermittent basis? The answer is yes. There was some uncertainty around it initially because early drafts of the House bill for the FFCRA had said that the leave could not be used intermittently. That language was taken out, and the Department of Labor has now created clear guidelines, some of which are not totally consistent with the text of the statute. It's a lot of their interpretation of how leave can be used intermittently. But for intermittent leave, employees that are required to report to work can use intermittent extended FMLA leave in full day increments. So if they're entitled to 12 weeks of paid leave, that's the equivalent of 60 business days. They can use, they can say, I need, I've got childcare coverage on Tuesday and Thursday, but I can't work Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I need to use 3 days a week of extended family medical leave. If you as the employer agree to it, you can do that, and they would essentially get 20 weeks of that sort of reduced schedule if you want to do that. Again, the Department of Labor guidelines are that the employer has to agree to the intermittent schedule, but again, the Department of Labor has expressly encouraged employers to be flexible, and generally speaking, that's what we're advising clients as well, is that if you can be flexible, you'll want to be flexible with that issue. Does the paid FMLA for employees teleworking, and this is sort of an odd wrinkle, employees who are teleworking are allowed to use, if the employer agrees, in order to get the tax rebate, employers are allowed to agree to even shorter increments of time, right? The IRS will allow you to take the tax credits for extended FMLA leave on an intermittent basis for employees teleworking for even shorter increments. And so if you have an employee that says, I can work half a day teleworking, my spouse and I have agreed, I watch the kids in the afternoon, she watches the kids in the morning. So I need 4 hours per day of extended FMLA for childcare reasons. For employees that are teleworking, the Department of Labor has said, yes, you can do that. You can do it in increments as small as you're willing to do. So just to sort of recap, for extended family medical leave, for employees that are reporting to work, it can be used on an intermittent basis in full day increments if they're required to report to the work site, and it can be used on an intermittent basis in increments as small as the employer is willing to provide for employees who are teleworking. Please remember that the paid FMLA leave does not extend to all qualifying FMLA leave, and unlike the paid sick leave, it's not in addition to other FMLA leave. So if you have an employee that's already exhausted all of their FMLA leave for the year, they've already used all 12 weeks before April 1, which is theoretically possible. So for example, if somebody had a child the first week of January, they may have used all of their FMLA leave. You don't need to provide them with an additional 12 weeks. Similarly, FMLA leave for any other purpose besides the childcare related reasons is not going to be paid. In the verification, the written verification you're going to get from the employee, you're going to have to include a statement that the employee's spouse is unable to watch the child. While it was not clear in the initial statute as to whether or not both parents would be able to take the extended family medical leave at the same time. So for example, I have a colleague that has 7 kids. If both of them said, look, we both need to take the EFMLA because one of us can't do it alone, under the Department of Labor guidelines, that's not permissible. So you're going to have to get a verification from the employee that their spouse is otherwise unavailable to take care of the children. Similarly, you get into questions of what counts as child care. Who is a child care provider under the law? Does it have to be paid? Can it be unpaid? And the Department of Labor, on this issue at least, has been extremely flexible. Anyone who regularly watches your children for you qualifies as a child care provider. So if you've got children in school and you're planning to use summer camp for child care over the summer, that's going to qualify. That's going to be a qualifying reason for extended family and medical leave if those summer camps are closed. If grandma watches the kids for you because, for free, out of the goodness of her heart, she enjoys spending the time with the grandchildren. If due to concerns related to COVID-19, you want to maintain social distancing, you don't want to have the kids going back and forth. If for that reason you're unable to have childcare available, that will also qualify for the extended family and medical leave. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone paid. So, if grandma's unavailable, you don't want grandma to be exposed to your kids, that's going to qualify. So for example, just even using myself as an example, my mother-in-law generally watches my kids 3 days a week. My wife's a nurse. She's going into the emergency room, twice a week. And so we don't know whether or not she's definitely being exposed to COVID-19, but we don't know if she's bringing it home or not because of the availability of PPE right now is still pretty good. We've said, look, it's not safe for grandma to watch the kids. So now our child care provider is technically unavailable. And if I needed to take leave under the FFCRA for that reason, I would be able to do so under the law. The first 2 weeks of the EFMLA are unpaid. We get a lot of questions about this. If the employee still has the paid sick leave available under the paid sick leave provisions, they can use those paid sick leaves to make that first 2 weeks paid. And so they would have 12 weeks of leave under the FFCRA. The first 2 weeks are paid under the paid sick leave provisions, and then the last 10 weeks are paid under the EFMLA. If you have other PTO available to your employees, you may permit them to use that paid leave to sort of boost the amount of daily pay they're getting, so that they're not. So if they want to get full pay instead of 2/3 pay, you can put out a plan that allows them to exhaust their other PTO, but you may not require it. Similarly, you can voluntarily pay them their full pay for time that they're on EFMLA leave, or if their daily earnings exceed $511, but you're not going to be able to claim a tax credit for amounts in excess of that. I know we spent a lot of time on the FFCRA. I want to move now to other business considerations such as furloughs, layoffs, and RIFS, and some of the provisions of the CARES Act. If you please, again, remember, if you have other questions, please feel free to shoot me an email or submit a question in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get the questions answered. Furloughs, layoffs, and RIFS. Technically speaking, if you're not the federal government, there's not really a difference between a furlough and a layoff other than semantics. When you tell an employee that they're being furloughed, what you're telling them is it's going to be for a short period of time and we intend to bring you back. For a layoff, you're not necessarily communicating that intent to bring them back if possible. Otherwise, for furloughs, some employers will do sort of rolling furloughs where 1 week on, 1 week off. They'll call a reduction in hours furloughs, things of that nature. And so essentially what you have to decide as an employer is, do I want to communicate to my employees that I have an intent to bring them back? Or do I want to sort of give them that certainty where, look, the structural damage to the business has been done by COVID-19. And even if we get back to business as usual in 2 months, we're going to have to drastically reduce our workforce. And so I want these employees to know now so that they can begin looking for other jobs. Otherwise, if you want them to stay ready, willing, and able to return to you, generally speaking, you're going to tell them they're furloughed so that they can still collect unemployment benefits and other resources that are being made available due to coronavirus and federal actions, but you want them to still be available. Please remember, for exempt employees, if you're going to do a furlough, if you're doing a reduction in hours, you need to pay exempt employees for any week in which they perform productive work, unless the reason for their full day absence is for their own purposes. For exempt employees, if you're not paying them for full days because you don't have enough work for them to do, you're technically in violation of the law. And so for exempt employees, if you're going to do reduced schedules, you will probably want to have them work rotating work weeks. So they work a full work week 1 week and not at all the next work week. Throughout all of this process, you want to be communicating with your employees. You don't want them guessing or wondering what's going on. You don't want them guessing or wondering what the criteria are for who is laid off and who is retained. And you need to be careful in terms of if you're offering severance in exchange for a release, that you're complying with the Older Workers Benefits Protection Act. One of the biggest issues that we see when employers are conducting furloughs, layoffs, or reductions in force is that charge filings and lawsuits track unemployment. They don't necessarily track social trends. As you can see from this chart, each year the EEOC lists the number of, provides information about the numbers of charges that are filed. And you can see, generally speaking, the numbers are below 85,000 per year. From 97 to 2006, you were seeing between 75 and 85,000 charge filings per year. And then there's a drastic jump of about 25%, about a 25% annual increase in 2008 when the recession hit. And that over time, that eventually went down. But generally speaking, the peak filing years are the years when businesses are conducting layoffs, when the job market is tight, and people are looking for any port in a storm. And so when you go through layoffs, you want to make sure you're communicating with employees so that they understand the reason and the criteria that are being used to eliminate their positions, so they don't just jump to, it's because I'm older, it's because I'm more highly paid, it's because I have child responsibilities, it's because I have a disability, it's because I fall under one or more protected categories. One of the reasons why this information is so interesting is if you look, charge filings at the peak of the recession in 2008 through 2012 are massively higher than the number of charge filings during the peak of the Me Too movement in 2018. Unemployment and not any social movement are what drive unemployment filings or charge filings. When you're talking about charge filings, these aren't just charge filings, but you also get the other wage and hour lawsuits, misclassification as exempt lawsuits, and other things. And so when you are doing a reduction in force, you're doing a layoff, you really want to go through and make sure that you're not targeting certain protected categories, that it's consistent with legitimate business concerns, so that if a charge is filed, you're able to provide that information to the EEOC or the Maryland, or whatever state agency is looking at the issue. If it's a lawsuit, that you're going to be able to present the information to the court to say, no, look, these are the legitimate reasons. This is how we determine who we were going to lay off. This is who we determined would receive a reduction in hours. Because if you're not able to do that, you're going to be in a position where you're going to be facing lawsuit after lawsuit. Again, just to get into some of my personal background, 2008 is when I became a full-time labor and employment lawyer. Prior to that, it was a portion of my time. But when employers were doing so many layoffs and reductions in force due to the economic downturn in 2008, there were so many charges being filed, that there was so much demand within my firm that's what I was doing full time. Moving in now to small businesses, the CARES Act has a lot of relief provisions for small businesses to enable them to keep people on payroll or make it economically advantageous to keep people on payroll. The CARES Act provides for the Paycheck Protection Program, an expansion of unemployment, as well as tax rebates for employers that are keeping people on payroll voluntarily without having to go through the Paycheck Protection Program. The Paycheck Protection Program, for those of you who are not aware, provides for small loans that are essentially designed to provide for 8 weeks of payroll costs, to keep full payroll for an 8-week period. The Paycheck Protection Program has a unique feature in a small business loan. It's administered by the Small Business Administration. And one of the unique features of the Paycheck Protection Program is that for the 8-week period following when the loan proceeds are dispersed, you can use this for payroll reasons and have the amounts that are used for certain qualifying reasons, such as payroll, rent, interest on mortgage payments, and certain utilities. You can have that amount forgiven, but the amount of forgiveness is reduced by any reduction in your payroll headcount. And so the idea being, you get this Paycheck Protection Program loan, you get everybody back on payroll. And so instead of having everybody on unemployment, you're paying people for another 8 weeks. You can keep your business operational. You can keep your employees. If you're not able to operate, you can at least keep them on the payroll. And so that when you are able to reopen, hopefully they're still ready, willing, and able to return. And that will allow sort of a minimal disruption to the economy. For employers that don't need a loan, the CARES Act has a 50% credit against the employer taxes up to $5,000 per employee for employees that you retain if you don't get a PPP loan. If you take out a PPP loan, you're not also eligible for the tax rebates. But so even if you don't participate in the Paycheck Protection Program, if you don't take out one of those loans, employers that are essential businesses that are still operating and keeping people on payroll, they're going to get the benefit of some tax rebates under that act. There's also been the expansion of unemployment so that employees who are laid off through no fault of their own, they are going to get an additional $600 per week of unemployment benefits. There's obviously, as everyone knows, the stimulus payment, which are being processed this week through direct deposit. The other piece of relief for small businesses that's been announced on a federal level is the expanded programs from the Federal Reserve through what's called the Main Street Lending Program. If you have already done a Paycheck Protection Program loan, or if you have other needs besides payroll, because the Paycheck Protection Program loans are limited to just essentially payroll, rent, utilities, mortgage interest. For employers and businesses that have experienced more structural damage and need larger loans, the Federal Reserve has expanded the Main Street Lending Program. These loans are a minimum of $1 million. It's a 4-year term. And they can be up to 4 times the company's annual revenues. So up to $25 million. So this is going to be a loan for that business that needs more help, that's experienced more damage due to lost revenues, business interruption due to COVID-19. And so the Main Street Lending Program, if you talk to your lender as to whether or not they're going to be offering loans under this program. But the idea under the Main Street Lending Program is for a longer period of time beyond just the next 8 weeks, businesses are going to be impacted. And so these are going to be loans at lower interest rates. These are not going to be forgivable loans, but they're not going to have the same restrictions as the Paycheck Protection Program, but they're still going to have generally favorable interest rates. And it's going to be a lot of money that's made available to banks to lend to businesses that have been affected by COVID-19 without having to go through the standard bank underwriting process. Because as we can expect, banks are going to be a little bit reticent to underwrite loans to businesses who, future prospects may be uncertain. I know I've covered a lot and we're probably we're over on time, but I do want to leave some time now for questions. I appreciate everyone taking the time today. Hopefully this has been of assistance to you. If you have other questions and you can't think of them now or don't want to share them with the group, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email is on the screen. You can call me directly. The phone here is still forwarding to my cell phone, so even though I'm working remotely, that's still available.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. And we'll give folks a couple minutes to chat in questions. I know we're over time, so if anyone has to run to another meeting, feel free to do so. But looks like we got a question here from Haley. I can read this for you, Greg. Could you speak to the work sharing program at all?
Okay, I'm assuming that's a Maryland question.
Yes. Haley
okay,
says
yeah.
yes.
Yep. So the Maryland Work Share Program is a program. It's interesting. Most attorneys don't know a lot about unemployment insurance because it's something that they process themselves. But so the Work Share Program It's a program offered by the Maryland Unemployment Commission. Big picture, because this is a little bit long-winded and I apologize in advance, but I want everyone to understand the big picture, because if you don't understand the big picture, the work sharing program doesn't necessarily make sense. In the state of Maryland and in most states, there's the weekly benefit amount that employees are entitled to that's the maximum an employee can get from unemployment. If an employee's hours are reduced, they can get the difference between what they've otherwise been earning, or they can get the difference between their weekly benefit amount and what they're now earning, minus $50. So for example, if an employee currently makes $600 per week, say they're making $15 an hour, they work 40 hours a week. Generally speaking, they're going to be making $600 per hour. And if you use the charts that the Maryland Unemployment Division makes available, their weekly benefit amount is about $315. And so if that employee's hours are cut in half, they're going to get essentially $65 a week in unemployment benefits. It's not a lot of money. Instead, what an employer can do when they're going to be doing a large-scale reduction in force or reduction in hours, they can apply, and it's something you have to apply for as the employer, for a work-sharing program through the Maryland Division of Unemployment Insurance. The work-sharing programs were created in the early 80s, generally speaking around reductions in force and the slowdowns around the steel mills and those related industries. And so they're designed for employees that are not necessarily making the lowest, they're not the lowest wage earners, but it enables them to receive the percentage of unemployment benefits that they would receive based on the reduction in number of hours. So going back to that individual who's making $600 per week, if they experience a reduction in hours to 50%, they would be getting their $300 per week that they make from wages plus $65 in unemployment, because they're getting $315 minus $250, because you take $50 off the top. So they're getting a total of $365. If you submit a work share plan, that individual instead is going to get 50% of what they would have otherwise gotten from unemployment. So look at the $300 they would earn plus 50% of 315, which is $157.50. So they're going to get $457.50. So they get about $100 more per week as a result of the employer doing the work share program. For the work share program, employees it has to be consistent. So you have to identify a group and you have to identify what the reduction in hours is going to be. You have to notify all the employees a week before you apply, and then you request the form from the Division of Unemployment Insurance. Unemployment's going to send you a spreadsheet where you're going to go through and identify the affected units or groups of employees. You're going to identify what their reduction in hours is going to be. And then you identify through a self-certification the number of employees who would otherwise have been fully laid off if you didn't do the work share program. And then there has to be a one-on-one correlation between the number of hours that are being offered through the work share and the number of employees who'd be laid off. So for example, if you have a group of 10 employees and you'd otherwise have to lay off 5, those 10 employees can work 50% of the time. It's a minimum reduction in hours between 20 and 80%. So you can take, if you have a group of 5 employees and you'd otherwise have to lay off one of them, you can simply reduce everyone's hours by 20%. They would get, their standard wages for their hours earned, and then they would get the 20% unemployment. Frequently, this is going to come into play because under Maryland law, if you're earning more than your weekly benefit amount, you don't get unemployment at all. And so for somebody that's working 80% of their schedule, they're not going to otherwise qualify for any kind of payment from unemployment. But if you do the work share, they will qualify for at least a small amount of unemployment benefits. There's a minimum payment that they make of $50. So even if you're entitled to $1 in unemployment, you'll get $50. And work share programs now appear to be attractive to employers because it looks like once the $600 stimulus is in play, they'll get that added on to any payment through a work share plan. It's complicated, and I'm sure that was probably long-winded, and people probably are scratching their head and saying, what is this person talking about? But if you have questions about work share programs, please reach out to me. I can walk you through it on a more individualized level.
Great, thank you. And Haley says thank you too. And like Greg said, he's definitely the expert here, and feel free to reach out to him if you have any questions about your personal situation or want to talk more about what's going on with your organization, company, or your employees. Greg, is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we wrap up here?
Honestly, this could probably be like a 4-hour webinar. I know these were a lot of high points. As things change, obviously, people are looking for answers. We have resources on our website, www.wcslaw.com, that are more in depth. But please, if you have questions, connect with me on LinkedIn, send me an email, give me a call. I'm happy to provide general guidance to people. If you have more specific questions, obviously we might need to discuss that, but, doing my best right now. We're a lot of lawyers now you'll see are trying to provide resources so that people can make the most of what's going on right now. It's a tough time, and understandably people have questions and concerns.
Right, absolutely. Well, we appreciate all the time you took today, Greg, to support your fellow Terps. And again, like Greg said, feel free to reach out to him. A recording of this webinar will be sent to your email, and a copy of the PowerPoint, as long as Greg's okay with that.
Yeah,
but again,
absolutely.
Great, thank you. And so huge thank you to Greg and everyone who tuned in today. Hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and go Terps. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.